message, bro. I was thinking about that. The truth was said here. And the truth is, so it's like, it's not a bad thing. It's just kind of saying, oh, well, like, I nuance that more, to understand the context more. And kind of realize that what happened is complicated, the context is complicated, the person is complicated. Yes. And in the midst of that, harm happened, real harm happened.
It is. I'm back. I'm up now. Cool. So enjoy our time together, and really feel at home. And I appreciate the questions that were asked. It just feels like the culture that y'all have cultivated in this church body is very safe and welcoming, and I can sense that. And I'm just so pleased to get to know you all and to participate in this with you all. So as we land the plane this afternoon, and I know we're getting to our end time, I just wanted to land maybe two topics. And the first topic is what we call secondary trauma and vicarious trauma. And the reason why this topic is important is because I know that there are many in your church body that are helping professionals. There's a lot of psychologists and counselors and teachers and nurses and social workers and what I want to highlight in this formal textbook definition of trauma is the first few words of this definition. It says, a traumatic event is characterized by the following: when a person has experienced, witnessed, or been confronted with an event or events, and you kind of complete the statement. And what I want to highlight here is that for someone to experience a trauma exposure, it's possible for a trauma exposure to be from direct experience, and it's also possible for trauma exposures to be through indirect experience, right? So for example, if I'm talking about a traumatic event like a horrible car accident, if I'm driving the vehicle, and I'm involved in that accident, that would be a trauma exposure because I personally firsthand witness and part of this traumatic event. But if I'm just walking down the street, I'm not in one of the cars, and I see this event unfold, and I bear witness to this event, guess what? According to the formal definition of a trauma, that too is a trauma exposure as well. So for a lot of the friends that I get to live with and serve in the church community that I'm a part of, we're part of a neighborhood where there's a lot of shootings and gangs and a lot of stuff that goes on, and people don't think of that as trauma. Living in a neighborhood where people involved in stuff, that actually is a trauma exposure as well. And part of the research that I do at Fuller, my title is I'm the chair of the formation of emotionally healthy leaders. And some of the research I work on is on trauma exposure among clergy and pastors. And we find that pastors and clergy are comparable to other helping professions in that we have some of the highest levels of trauma exposure of all the different kinds of careers and vocations as possible. So in fact, one study found that the rates of PTSD among pastors is actually higher than, again, military combat veterans. And that's, again, because of trauma exposure, not only in our personal lives, but also the lives that we get to pastor and the people that we get to accompany. And that makes sense because who are the people who, especially if you're in a church community, like who gets that first phone call when something happens, right? Oftentimes it's the pastor. Who's the person who's doing not just the weddings, but the funerals? Who's doing the grief counseling? Oftentimes it's the pastor. And I'm not sure if we usually think of it in this way, but every time that happens, that's actually a trauma exposure for the pastor. And whereas for our friends in the military who go off to fight foreign wars, there's a whole infrastructure of support before, during, and after deployment, but there isn't really anything like that for pastors or with other helping professionals. So that's the first topic I wanted to start us off with, which is this topic of secondary trauma. And the topic of secondary trauma goes like, the logic behind secondary trauma goes like this. So if trauma can be defined as witnessing somebody else going through a trauma, like, violence, abuse, neglect, and if our day-to-day work responsibilities as a counselor, as a social worker, as a pastor, as a helping professional, it brings us into direct and or indirect contact with a population with a high prevalence of trauma, is it possible for helping professionals to develop PTSD symptoms of their own? And the answer is yes. Right? We call that secondary traumatic stress, when we develop our own symptoms because we're exposed to other people's trauma. And with secondary traumatic stress, every single symptom of PTSD is in play, right? It could, so, if we were to diagnose PTSD, we'd look for re-experiencing symptoms like intrusive thoughts. We look for hyperarousal symptoms. We look for avoidance symptoms, negative alterations in cognition, and all that's in play. It could actually be triggered by a one-time event, right? And the literature on secondary trauma, the literature on vicarious trauma, it's actually the same literature, or it's the literature connected to things like burnout and compassion fatigue, right? And one of the key figures that put that literature on the map is this guy named Charles Figley, back in 1995, and he described compassion fatigue as quote unquote, the cost of caring. So the people who are most vulnerable to things like secondary trauma and vicarious trauma are actually those people in your community that are empathetic. Like the hearts, like the bleeding hearts of the community, the ones that are attuned to what other people are feeling and are empathetic and are compassionate, they're actually most at risk for things like this, right? I made a joke about narcissism earlier, and for people who are narcissistic, they're not that vulnerable for secondary trauma because there's little to no capacity for empathy, right? Not too worried about this for that particular population. But for those who are really caring and are in the front lines of pastoral work and caring for each other, this is actually something that we really need to take seriously. So what are examples of direct and indirect contact, exposure to trauma? If your line of work leads you to interview people who have been abused or neglected as children, if you're interviewing or interacting with family members where abuse is happening, if you're working with teachers, so teachers is another high trauma exposure vocation, physicians, neighbors. We had a sister talk about child removal. Social work is a really high trauma exposure kind of career as well. And indirect contact, like reading case files, reading medical records, reading court records, reading school records, those are all potential forms of exposure, indirect exposure to trauma. What are symptoms of secondary trauma? It includes emotional symptoms, physical symptoms, personal symptoms, as well as workplace symptoms. And oftentimes, when we look at experiences these symptoms, we may not connect the dots in a way where we realize that maybe some of these symptoms might actually be due to exposure to trauma. And here is a chart that talks about at least four different professions. There's firefighters, there's paramedics, and then there's social workers that work in children and family services. And when we think of firefighters and paramedics, those are usually like, oh yeah, those are high trauma professions. When something really dangerous is happening, those are the ones that go in, right? And yet, trauma exposure in those professions are somewhere around the 30%. In social work, when you work with children and families, we're looking at 60 to 70 to 80%, right? Here's another set of studies. Humanitarian aid workers at 8 to 10%, social workers at 15%, clinicians treating patients diagnosed with cancer, around 20%, child protective service workers, 33%, and clinicians treating sexual offenders and sexual abuse. There's something about sexual trauma and children. When those two are combined, it really, it can cause damage to those of us who are working with these populations as well. And one study that we just published a few years ago looked at the prevalence rates of secondary traumatic stress. And in a sample of clergy, we observed that 50% of our sample of clergy had clinically significant anxiety. 30% potentially can be diagnosed with PTSD, 14% with clinically significant depression. And the 52% STS, it's not mild, it's actually moderate and severe. So moderate and severe secondary traumatic stress, we saw 52% of our clergy sample report that in our research. Another term that I want to introduce to us is a similar term to secondary traumatic stress, and that is called vicarious traumatization. And it's similar. It captures the impact of indirect trauma exposure on the person who's bearing witness, on the person who's helping. Vicarious traumatization, it talks about harmful changes that indirect exposure to trauma can cause on the way that we view ourselves, in the way that we view others, in the way that we view the world as a result to exposure to traumatic material. The way that I understand the difference between secondary trauma and vicarious trauma is that when I think of secondary trauma, I think more of PTSD symptoms, right? So those are kind of the more traditional PTSD symptoms. When I think of vicarious traumatization, I think of the more subtle ways that our heart and our personality change over time, right? So I don't know if you've ever met people who, for example, when they started a teaching career, or when they started a career in counseling or in psychology, or when they started as a pastor 20, 30 years ago, 10, 20, 30 years ago. And at the time when they started, they were full of energy, full of empathy, full of compassion. And it just felt like over time, the personality just started to harden. They started to get cynical, they started to get darker. And after about 10, after 20, after 30 years, it's like almost like the personality, when you put them side by side, like, wow, you've changed. You can tell like the work has kind of chipped away and has hardened your personality, And that's what I usually think of when I think of vicarious traumatization. It's the pervasive and the cumulative effects of indirect exposure to trauma over time. Not just a one-time kind of thing, but it's one after another, after another, after another, over year after year after year. And it's subtle from day to day, but over time, you might observe some significant shifts in one's deeply held beliefs about things like our safety, our capacity to trust other humans, how we see ourselves, how we see others, how we see the world. And a lot of times I struggle with this too, right? Where when you see what humans are capable of doing, it's hard to unsee that, right? And go, wow, I'm not sure if I can trust people anymore, right? It's easier to idealize people before you actually do the work of working with people. And after you do that, it's almost like you have to struggle with, do I still have faith in humanity? Obviously, Jesus does, but do I? And sometimes it's tempting to feel hopeless at times. It's tempting to feel despair. Where the professional or the individual comes to doubt deeply held beliefs about their own safety, trust in the kindness of others, or a sense of control over their own circumstance, right? So some qualities that might emerge are, like we feel distressed. We not only lose trust in others, but we even lose trust in ourselves. We begin to dissociate, which we spoke of earlier this afternoon, and that's certainly a trauma response. And it also affects our friendships and our relationships. A lot of times we begin to withdraw, and our social circle gets smaller and smaller. Even though we need more social support, it feels like we just don't have the energy or interest in that kind of thing as much anymore, right? What are risk factors for vicarious traumatization? There's increased exposure to severe symptoms. Those of us who are new in our job and bright-eyed and a bit naive, I was all of those things. We might be a bit more vulnerable. People with a self-sacrificing approach to helping others are particularly vulnerable. People who, when I work with people, and I think I might even, probably belong to this category as well. So many people in helping professions, and this includes psychology students, we come from childhood trauma histories, and so many pastors I work with come from childhood trauma histories. And when I get into people's stories, I find stories of, these are the kids that functioned as adults in their family. Because the actual adults in the family, for whatever reason, were either not present or couldn't function as adults. So these were the kids that, even though they're 12, they acted like they're 30, and they kept the family together, and they took a sacrificial approach, and they didn't have a childhood. And there's, again, beauty and brokenness in this story, because I think the beauty of it is that these are some of the most kind, generous, sacrificial people that are willing to carry the load of a whole system on their shoulders to protect other people, to protect younger siblings, to keep the family together, like the most selfish, selfless people I've ever met. At the same time, these are some people who kind of sucked with boundaries because they never learned boundaries before, right? And what does that look like? When I grew up in a family system where I never learned good boundaries, I learned that I can take responsibility for my emotions and the emotions of everyone around me. That's not a good thing generally, because we don't have control over anyone else's emotions, and we barely have control over our own emotions, right? And when I talk to other fellow pastors about this, I make a joke that's, there's some truth here. I go what happens when you take a pastor with poor boundaries and you put him in a church? They take full advantage of that situation. So, and similarly, what happens when you take a loving, good teacher and put them in a school with, poor boundaries and lots of needs? They're going to take full advantage of that teacher as well, right? So all this conversation about burnout, we need to go deeper than self-care. Self-care is good, but a lot of times when you keep diving and digging into someone's history and someone's story, usually it's a lot more than self-care. Usually it's these childhood dispositions that make us vulnerable to carry way too much on our backs. Lack of organizational support and regular exposure to specific kinds of traumas, like those involving sexual abuse. But one of the things I'd love to explore with you all and is to talk a little bit about how trauma exposure can also shape our spiritual formation. All right? And I would suggest that trauma can form us in really helpful ways, even spiritually, and trauma can also malform us in very unhelpful ways, even including in our spiritual life as well. Some research, and there's not too much, there's a few of us, are looking at how trauma can impact the spiritual life. And we find that for many of us, trauma can actually deeply disrupt some of our deeply held spiritual and religious beliefs. In fact, our colleagues Dombo and Gray, who are Christian social workers, in one of the papers they published, I quote them, and they say, "The hallmark of vicarious traumatization is disrupted spirituality," where we get a sense of, we lose our sense of purpose and meaning in our work, whether that's ministry work or our helping profession work. And that's why when we are trying to tend these kinds of wounds, it's not enough for us to just treat the psychological symptoms. We also need to provide support for not just emotional recovery or physiological recovery, but also spiritual recovery as well. So what I'd like to do for the next few moments is I want to invite and pick your brain about what you think about this. So with a few people next to you, if you feel comfortable doing so, don't feel obligated, I'd like you all to discuss and explore in what ways might trauma actually how might it be harmful? How might it impact in a not helpful way our relationship with God and our spiritual journey? Have you observed anything like that before? Discuss. Sure. Let me give you my. Can I write it here? Okay, let's come back together. Yeah, this is a tough question. And, even when I was working in a non-Christian context as a psychologist with trauma survivors, I will frequently get questions like, why did God allow this to happen? Right? How do I make sense of this? Why didn't he protect me from this? Anyone open to sharing what y'all talked about? Like, how might trauma impact the spiritual life? Yeah.
Part of my trauma with my spiritual walk was this constant tension of whether or not my salvation was secured. It was the way I was raised. There was this: you gotta do this
Actually,
thing.
let me turn this on so other people can hear.
You gotta keep the Sabbath. And it was like I've never, and how I was raised, I could never keep it right. It was always something that we were having to run after all the time, but
Yeah.
year after year, week after week, Sabbath after Sabbath, it was very anxiety-inducing and just never knowing that my salvation was secure. I finally said, I don't want to serve this kind of God. If he's going to keep me in a state of anxiety, I don't want this. And so I left. And it's probably the best thing that I could have done for my spiritual walk, for my family's spiritual walk, because I was carrying that on to my children, and being exposed to the strongly held beliefs over time. And so that was my trauma that I'm working through.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. And that's unfortunately so common. There's different reasons why this is the case, but when I work with believers who have survived trauma, it's very common for those believers to blame themselves for what's happening, or to maybe even interpret what happened through the lens of, I must have done something wrong, God's punishing me, or I must be losing my salvation and this is evidence of that. Even when it's a situation where, objectively speaking, like, you had nothing to do with this, but there's something about being humans where we oftentimes will do that mental gymnastics to find a way to blame ourselves for what happened. And there's at least a couple reasons why, but there's probably a lot of them, and I might go into them. But thank you for starting us off with that, sharing. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
We talked about church-related trauma as well, whether that be people from the church, from the body of the church, traumatizing somebody, or it happening in the physical building of the church, or a spiritual leader that might traumatize somebody, and then that would affect someone's spiritual journey.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. At Fuller, we just hosted a symposium on spiritual abuse and trauma. And we invited Dan Allender and some friends and it was a very poorly prepared, planned gathering. We did it right before Christmas, and it was scheduled the first week of, January when people returned. But we had 300-400 people show up, and it seemed to hit a nerve, that topic of spiritual trauma, or trauma that happens in the church context. So Sometimes we joke about how nowadays people go to seminary not to study the Bible. They go to heal from their spiritual trauma. And then I will say that though that's understandable, seminaries aren't very well equipped to do that, although we're trying to change some of that. Yeah, but there's a lot more to say, and then thank you for naming that. Was there another? Yes, Nick.
As children. And it's not that we don't believe, but we're not truly rooted in who he calls us and what was done on the cross. If that even makes sense.
It does,
It's
yeah.
like a subconscious, we don't know that there's even trauma. We just think that's just the way it is.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's a problem with the majority of Christians who believe in Jesus. But they don't walk in what the cross means and how it can cleanse us.
Yeah. Thank you, Nick. I absolutely agree with you. And that's actually one of the reasons why, in addition to trauma work, I do a lot of work on spiritual formation and discipleship. And typically in churches in America and in the West, we look at discipleship through teaching truths, through the lens of teaching truths and teaching beliefs, right doctrine, and that's still a good thing. I like that, and teaching truth. But even in Scripture, there are passages like Romans chapter 7, if you guys remember, I do what I don't want to do, and what I hate, that's what I end up doing, And I'm reminded of that passage when I hear about, well, they do believe it, but there's something deeper that's going on that might be inconsistent with what they believe. And one way to look at it is through the work of Thomas Aquinas, so one of the great theologians of all of church history. He asked the question, from the perspective of Scripture and the Christian faith, what does it mean to be human? Are we just purely thinking beings? And, so I don't want to nerd out too much, but, have you heard of Rene Descartes, and the Enlightenment, I think, therefore I am? That's actually a statement about human anthropology. So what he's saying is that fundamentally humans are thinking beings, But I would suggest that, but Aquinas says that humans are not just thinking beings. They certainly are thinking beings, but they're also feeling beings, and they're choosing beings. So he talks about how God endowed humans not just with a mind that can think, but also a heart that can feel. He called those affections. And he also endowed humans with a will to choose, free will. So the reason why I'm so interested in spiritual formation is I'm asking, I think all of us need to ask questions like, what does it look like to disciple not just our mind, but also to disciple our emotions and our heart, and also to disciple our will, our choice. Because in that case with Romans chapter 7, I do what I don't want to do, and what I don't want to do, then I hate, that's what I do. The problem there is not fundamentally a truth problem, right? That person actually knows enough truth to know that what he's doing is something that he's not supposed to be doing. So we can't approach that problem as with the perspective that, if I just teach that person some more truth, that that's going to solve that problem. Because that's not fundamentally a truth problem. He already knows enough to know that he's not supposed to do it, but that's the problem, is that he's not choosing that. He's not choosing what he already knows, and his heart does not actually love what he knows already, the truth that he knows, right? Why are we fragmented between what we know and what's in our heart and what we end up choosing in life? It's a very complicated question, but actually trauma might be part of what's going on. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Yes.
So we talked about, I think we did back into the first part we talked about in the first hour, but
Yeah.
we're talking about how certain understandings of spirituality, especially like forgiving other people,
Hmm.
can lead to, I think, either not really recovering from what happened,
Yeah.
trauma, or minimizing what has happened to you as you kind of, as things get maybe you enter into adulthood.
Yes.
That prevents healing. And then I would kind of add to that it then kind of keeps your spirituality at that really, really maybe first level, because you're really not going deep.
Yeah.
And talking to others or with God about things that really happened. So you're just kind of staying at a pretty superficial, early level of understanding spiritual life.
That's right. Absolutely. And, I think another example of kind of the early level spiritual life, and I think this ties with what was shared at the very beginning about how Christians oftentimes will blame ourselves or see that there might be something wrong with my faith or my salvation as a result of trauma. And that comes from something that we call the just world hypothesis. And what is the just world hypothesis? The just world hypothesis is that good things happen to good people, and bad things happen, to bad people. So what happens when an innocent Christian, out of no fault of their own, they had to grow up in a family where they got abused? And it wasn't their sin, but it was a sin of their family members. Somehow we will reverse engineer this into some conclusion that says this: something horrible happened to me, that must mean I'm a bad person to deserve this. What do you say to a Christian who has come to that conclusion? Because it's so pervasive. So many of us unconsciously or consciously believe that. Any thoughts? Yes.
Especially what happened to that person actually happened in the context of something you were not supposed to.
That's tough,
So
yeah.
let's say if you are a believer and as a teenager you are told, you're not to drink alcohol, you're not to go to parties, or whatever it is, and you make a choice to do those things and something happens to you, then that completely affirms this theory.
Right.
Right? Is that it happened to me because I sinned. It happened to me because I didn't follow what I had been told in the church by my parents, so therefore it's my fault.
Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of our later in life, or especially in those teenage years, a lot of the things that go wrong is because of mistakes that we made because of our immaturity or our age and whatever it is, but you can easily blame yourself for it if you don't have a rooted understanding of grace, and parents love you through the ups and downs of growing up and becoming an adult.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes I might even add, certainly the choices we make can make us vulnerable to trauma. But does that necessarily mean that we deserved it? It doesn't. So say I went to a party and I probably shouldn't have drank that much. Does that mean that it was fully justified for someone to take advantage of me when I was in that state? No, that's still the sin of the other person, right? Yeah. And then sometimes I might get theological, and I'll go, hey, there's a whole book in the Bible that talks about the just world hypothesis, and that book of the Bible is Job. And we got Job's friends that talked all about the just world hypothesis. You got like chapters and chapters of good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people, so therefore all this bad stuff that's happening to you, Job, must mean that you did something bad. And guess what? God wasn't very happy with those friends of Job, right? And there's another theological point, which is Jesus. Horrible things happened to Jesus, and he didn't sin at all, right? We live in a world that's not just. And in an unjust world, the definition of injustice is that we get punished for doing the right thing, right? So, oddly enough, even though 99% of the Sunday school lessons I learned growing up at church taught the just world hypothesis, which is, don't be like the Israelites, and they did bad in the sight of the Lord and they got punished, but then they did good in the sight of the Lord and God blessed them. So be like King Hezekiah and not like Josiah, and not, and therefore be a good girl and a good boy so that good things can happen to you. We can't stay there, friends. The faith actually says something much more nuanced and much more liberating than the just world hypothesis. So this has really important implications on our spiritual formation. We have to grow out of this if we want to mature in the Christian faith. It doesn't mean we don't do good stuff, but we do good stuff knowing that we live in a world where sometimes we might be punished for doing good, but we still do good anyway, because we're following Christ and God invites us. And we know bad things happen to the righteous as well, but that doesn't mean we stop being good. All right, any other thoughts before we continue? But one of the questions I'm always thinking of now is, how do we teach something different than this to kids? Knowing that there's, developmentally, they might need different supports. I do think at a certain age, that's still a good thing to teach. But I think when they reach a certain point in time, maybe when they're teenagers and they're capable of more abstract thought, we really need to start adding some nuance to that. Yeah. Okay, we'll start landing the plane. Let me share one more thought, and hopefully this will be a bit more hopeful. I know so much of what we talked about is really heavy. And what I want to talk about is, looks like my slides are stuck in the back, is the topic of social support. So when people ask, me the question, well, how do we heal? How do we support each other through things like trauma? And the research suggests that one of the most important sources of support to mitigate the negative impact of trauma is actually social support. And this is why I care so much about working with churches like yours to talk about stuff like trauma. Because when I think of, remember that definition from Robert Stollerow, trauma is what happens when intense emotional pain cannot find a relational home in which it can be held. I cannot think of a better person to be that relational home than Jesus, and I can't think of a better human community to hold pain than the local church, And we find that social support, including social support that we give and receive within a church community, is actually one of the most powerful determinants that can either facilitate or impair recovery from trauma. And research has found that social support can be positive social support. There's a different kinds of social support. There can be positive social support that makes us feel loved and seen and supported, and can also be negative social support that makes us feel unloved, unseen, and judged. And the lack of social support, especially the presence of negative social support, research has found is actually one of the strongest predictors of PTSD post-trauma, right? And in fact, one study found that social support actually more strongly predicted PTSD than other factors such as prior trauma history, prior mental illness, and even the severity of the traumatic event itself. Can you believe that? So, and this is so highlighted in the research literature that a lot of colleagues would say that when someone has PTSD, it's not just pointing to what happened in their life, but it's usually an indicator that there was some epic failure in their social support network. 99% of the people that I work with that have developed PTSD had some epic failure in their social support network. What's an example of this? You have a young woman who survived a sexual assault, and after months, they drum up the courage to share about what happened to receive support. And what's the first thing they hear? You should have been more careful. That is an example of a failure of social support, right? And that's one of the reasons why we blame ourselves, right? So how your loved ones and how your trusted friends respond and hold your trauma actually makes a huge difference on your recovery journey or on your recovery journey. So, what do you think of these phrases? So let me share a few more things, a few more examples of negative social support. One form of negative social support is doubt. So negative social support are reactions that are intended or perceived as critical, blaming, or grossly insensitive. So one form of negative social support is doubt, where your loved ones question the accuracy of your description of events, and they wonder, well, does this actually qualify as a trauma or not? And another form of negative social support is encouraging avoidance. Oh, just stop thinking about it. Don't worry about it. And a lot of people use that one part of Scripture in a horrible way, where it says, whatever is true, whatever is good, whatever is pure, think of those things. Whatever is lovely. You're going through trauma. It's a lot of negative stuff. It's not good and positive. And don't think of those things. Only think of the positive things. That's actually not what that passage in Philippians is talking about. But I've heard that all the time. And there's indifference, where you just change the topic. You don't even acknowledge the impact of what happened. I don't know if you've ever heard this. People say this. Not in this church, but maybe other churches, the churches you were before. Don't feel bad. Keep your head up. This was part of God's plan. It's God's will. You have to be strong for fill in the blank. You're strong, you'll get through this. God intended this for your good. You should be grateful. At least you still have, fill in the blank. The victory is already yours. Well, it could have been worse. That person could have, everything's going to be okay. I understand. Maybe it's because you're in sin, or maybe because you made some poor choices. If you repent, or if you change, fill in the blank, your problem will be solved. So with a few people next to you, what do you think of these phrases? How helpful is that for people who've gone through trauma? And then maybe, if you have time, is there something better that we can say that honors the faith and honors the Bible too, but actually is helpful for someone who's just survived trauma? Discuss. Okay, let's come back together. So I heard a set of collective groans and grunts when I read some of these phrases. So I have some guesses as to what you guys were talking about. But anyone open to sharing like what y'all talked about? Like, have you heard of this? What do you do with it?
I was thinking of I hear you saying things happen for a reason. So that's part of God's plan. It's God's will. And it's very common saying. Instead of what Nella was mentioning in her session, listening.
Yeah.
I don't understand. But that is a very common thing, is want to be fixers.
Yeah. And when we're fixers, who benefits most from the fixing? So this is for us, not actually the trauma survivor. We get to put our world in a neat bow. We don't have to struggle with what you're struggling with. That's not very helpful. Anyone else open to sharing? Yes.
Well, with these slides, you're just showing us and proving us that we've been doing and saying. With that, you've been proving us and showing us that we've been saying the wrong things forever and ever. I work with families, and the first thing that taught us is you need to meet the person where the person is at, wherever that it is. You walk into someone's home, and you walk with an empty mind and an empty everything, but with a big heart.
Yeah. Thank you. Any other thoughts? Yes. I have it.
Well, we also talk about, like, what's the extreme event? Like, we was trying to figure out, like, what is the event that's occurred? If you're at the airport and you was trying to get there at a certain time and you missed your plane flight, you know, you got on the plane, right? Yeah. Oh, well, unless they got something. It's like, that's just the reaction. But the thing is, like, missing a plane flight, get on a plane flight to make your vacation, yes, you arrive there an hour later or 3 hours later, it depends on them. But it's not usually, because that happens to people so often, it's not really a really traumatic event, usually. But we was thinking more like, what happens in trauma, and it's like, yeah, I've heard that it's God's will, and I'm like, how can you say that? You know, when someone has just, you know, been through a school shooting, or someone who just went ahead and survived, you know, a sexual victim assault, you know what I'm saying? They were victimized. And so it's like, what are we going to do there?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I thank you for sharing these, but yeah, I've heard it. And, you know, I think it's just, it depends on the event. And I think that sometimes we hear the minimum events and we want to use the same phrases for those events for a more traumatic event.
I love that. So it's not like we should never say these. There's a place for them.
But this slide has traumatized
Well, thanks to you, I realized I've lived in trauma my whole life because of, you know, just the church that I went to and growing up, I did hear a lot of this, and so up until about my 30s, I realized that I was a Christian because of fear, right? Because of what happened if I didn't do the right thing, right? Like that whole just world theory, that was my whole life, and so so that's part one, but it's okay, I'm good. And the other thing is, it kind of goes along with what Nella said, like some of these phrases might be true, but not at that moment, right? And from my personal experience, you know, I had a loss of 2 pregnancies, and, you know, looking back, right, I have 4 children now, and 2 of those daughters came after the losses, and the timing and all of the different things that happened with that, it was part of God's plan for my family, to have not them at that moment, but have them now, just because of how everything turned out. But if someone would have told me that, right, in that moment, hey, you know, that it's part of God's plan that you lose your children, that was not the right timing, but I had to come to that conclusion on my own.
Yeah. After a long journey of grief and walking through that, but it's something that you come to on your own.
Correct.
Oh,
So,
that's
yeah,
good.
I'm kind of with her, like we have. I'm saying the wrong things, but there's a time.
Thank you.
saying these things and I should be saying these things. So it feels like it can become a very kind of scripted activity. And also I think another challenge for me is that sometimes I just want to sit there without saying anything, but that can be read as kind of apathy or insensitivity.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of, it just feels like there's so many kind of cultural layers that stand between, like even when these phrases are being said, the person obviously cares, and yet I'm not able to receive that care.
Great point. I love how you think deeply and critically, and I agree fully. This is not meant to be a mechanical exercise. Don't say this and say this script instead. Although to be fair, I think some other things would probably be a lot more helpful. I think that would still actually be helpful to not say these things and maybe say other things. But I think the larger principle that's more important than all of that is the principle of attunement and relational presence, right? Because when you're trying to fix someone and give them the right answer, assuming that the right answer is just going to fix their problems and you're going to feel good after that, you're actually not attuned and you're not relationally present to their lives. And it's very possible to be attuned and to be relationally present, as you said, without saying a word, right? So even if you don't say a word, as long as it's culturally congruent, eye contact, lean in. Demonstrate that you're like, wow, this is rough, so I'm gonna get down on the floor, on the ground level, you know? Look like, if people say compassion is when you allow someone else's pain, allow your heart to be moved by someone else's pain. And when that happens, then I think people are going to know. So sometimes I can just use But the most important thing is that attunement. And like you said, I actually feel like sometimes the most appropriate thing to do or to say is actually nothing. Because sometimes I'm boggled with you, I'm perplexed. But I'm with you relationally. I think of in Sunday school we had that joke. If we want to memorize a Bible verse, we want to memorize the shortest Bible verse, which was when Jesus wept. And the larger context of that was actually with Lazarus, right? So Lazarus just died, and Jesus was about to raise Lazarus from the dead. And what Jesus did when he first heard the news that Lazarus died was Jesus wept. Right? That's attunement. That's relational presence to the grieving that is happening with all the other disciples that have a relationship with Lazarus. And sometimes I wonder, Jesus could have been a killjoy, and he could have spent, hey, y'all, don't worry about it, I'm going to raise him from the dead, don't be sad, this is going to have a happy ending, right? And that actually would have been true, he would have raised him, but Jesus didn't say that. Even though he knew he was going to raise him from the dead, he chose to be present to where they were at that moment. So Jesus wept is actually one of the most beautiful, captures one of those beautiful scenes of Jesus being attuned and relationally present with others. He didn't give an answer even though the answer was there. But for us, a lot of times the answer isn't there. We don't know, just as anyone else. Okay, we're going to land the plane in just a moment or two. Is there maybe one last comment or question from anyone? I've so appreciated this time together. You guys are really a joy to chew through these things together. Why don't I close this up with a prayer? Lord, thank you so much for the people that you've gathered here. Thank you so much for this conversation that you have curated and made possible. This conversation that was not merely about an exchange of information, but the sharing of our hearts, the sharing of our stories, an invitation to invite other people to walk with us through many of the sources of pain in our lives that we may not have a good answer to yet. much of it is, some of it may not be resolved yet. We still love you, we still trust you, and we're still following you. And we're still, and we need each other. We need each other's encouragement. Because best way to do it is to do it together, to follow you, even in the midst of these ongoing challenges and hurts and pains. I pray that this day can be an encouragement for those of us, that we can receive what you'd like us to receive. If there's one or two nuggets from what people have shared that you would like us to hold in our hearts in the days to come, would you plant those seeds in our heart? In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you to Dr. David Wang, and thank you to our breakout session leaders, Melissa and Mel. And to our behind-the-scenes team that has helped make this possible. Our gift to you all, and now may the Lord bless you and keep you. May His face shine upon you and give you peace. Amen. There's a resource table that Dr. Angela Lee